Life inside Goulburn Supermax, home to Australia's most dangerous criminals. If you crave the darkest corners of true crime, the mysteries no one dares to touch, and the stories that keep investigators awake at night, hit subscribe, like, and drop a comment. Because what you're about to hear isn't just a story. It's a warning. The night it all began, the streets of Sydney were already humming with unease. Police radios crackled with overlapping chatter. Sirens wailed in distant bursts, and a humid tension hung in the air like a storm waiting to break. At 2:17 a.m., two patrol cars cornered a black Holden Commodore on a narrow industrial road near Botany Bay. Inside sat a man whose name alone sent shockwaves through Australia's criminal underworld. Damon Huxley, the mastermind behind one of the most feared syndicates operating on the East Coast. Huxley wasn't a loud criminal. He didn't carve his name into headlines with messy violence or reckless displays. He was precise, calculating, and disturbingly calm, a man who built his empire through strategy, silence, and pressure. People didn't fear him because of what he did. They feared him because of what he could do. As officers approached the immobilized vehicle, they expected chaos, a desperate run, a shootout, a frantic attempt to escape. Instead, they found Huxley sitting perfectly still, hands already resting on the steering wheel, eyes forward, as though he'd known this moment was coming, as though he'd chosen it. The arrest was clean, too clean. Within hours, detectives from the organized crime squad were whispering among themselves. Evidence had come in shockingly fast: bank transfers, eyewitness accounts, coded communications decrypted in record time. It felt like someone had guided the investigation, pointing them directly to Huxley with a path lit by breadcrumbs he never should have left behind. But the prosecution didn't ask questions. They had their prize. At trial, Huxley barely spoke. He watched witnesses testify against him with an unsettling stillness, as if measuring each betrayal. Former associates, low-level crew members, and even a childhood friend took the stand to secure their deals. The judge called the case one of the most unusually cooperative criminal prosecutions in recent history. In the end, Damon Huxley was sentenced to life imprisonment with no possibility of parole. His destination: the most fortified, isolated, and psychologically crushing prison in the country, Goulburn Supermax, known by inmates simply as the Tomb. Yet even as officers transported him to the facility, the questions grew louder. Why had Huxley surrendered so easily? Why had so many loyal members of his syndicate flipped overnight? And how had the police, after years of dead ends, suddenly seized enough evidence for an airtight conviction? None of it made sense. Inside Goulburn Supermax, Huxley's arrival caused a quiet ripple. The prison's population consisted of Australia's most dangerous individuals, high-risk extremists, violent gang leaders, contract killers, men who thrived on reputation. Yet the moment Huxley stepped through those reinforced steel doors, even the hardest criminals paused. He moved like someone who had already studied the layout, the routines, the guard shifts. Like someone who had planned for this place long before he ever entered it. Within a month, rumors started spreading through the razor-wire halls. Despite being locked in a cell 22 hours a day, monitored through cameras, and stripped of any direct contact with other inmates, Huxley seemed to know things, information about prison transfers, brewing disputes, contraband movements. Whispered messages appeared to travel between cells with eerie efficiency. Conflicts between rival groups stopped overnight. Two high-profile inmates who refused to listen were quietly transferred after anonymous tips reached correctional officers. It was as if Huxley had turned Goulburn Supermax, one of the most controlled environments on Earth, into his new headquarters. Outside the prison walls, the streets told a similar tale. Instead of collapsing, the Huxley syndicate adapted. It reorganized. It grew quieter and more dangerous. Investigators noticed coded communications slipping through untraceable channels, all carrying the same signature structure Huxley was known for using. The man serving life without parole seemed somehow more powerful behind bars than he ever was on the outside. Still, the truth behind his surrender remained a mystery. That mystery deepened when a newly assigned officer stumbled upon an irregularity in the evidence logs, something small, something almost invisible, until he followed the trail backward and realized it shouldn't exist at all. The discovery pulled him into a vortex of questions that led directly to one sealed file, buried deep within the system, marked with a simple warning. Access restricted. Open only with authorization. He opened it, and what he found wasn't just unexpected. It was impossible. Because inside that file was a detailed communication, dated months before the arrest, written by Damon Huxley himself, predicting his capture, his trial, and his exact sentence. Every step of the investigation, every witness, every coincidence. Planned. By him. The officer stared at the document, pulse hammering, skin prickling. And then he saw the final line, a line that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Phase 1 completed. The real work begins inside Goulburn. The officer tried to report it, but by the next morning he had vanished, without a trace. The report of the missing officer barely made it past the morning briefing before disappearing into a maze of bureaucratic silence. Officially, he'd taken unexpected personal leave. Unofficially, everyone who had interacted with him the day before sensed something darker. Attention moved through the halls of Goulburn Supermax like static before a lightning strike. Officers lowered their voices. Inmates watched more closely. And Damon Huxley, locked in his sterile concrete box, seemed almost amused. What no one knew was that the officer's discovery of the sealed file had already set off a chain reaction. 3 days after his disappearance, a new inmate arrived under unusual circumstances. He had no gang ties, no violent history, no prior interest from major investigative units. His charges, fraud, embezzlement, financial tampering, didn't belong in a maximum security pressure cooker like Goulburn. Yet there he was, Elias Ward, 34, quiet, pale, with the demeanor of a man who spent more time behind computer screens than street corners. On paper, his placement was an error. In reality, it was a message. Huxley received it immediately. From the moment Elias was escorted past his cell block, the air shifted. Goulburn was already a place of isolation, but that day the silence felt purposeful, as if every camera, every lock, every reinforced wall was leaning in to witness something inevitable. Elias barely lasted 20 minutes before a code red stopped all movement. Officers sprinted toward his holding cell. They found him collapsed on the concrete, clutching his throat, gasping for air, eyes bulging with terror. The paramedics who rushed him to the infirmary said it looked like an allergic reaction. But to what? No one could determine. He'd eaten nothing. He'd touched nothing. He was alone. But during the chaos, one detail slipped by unnoticed. From his cell, Huxley had been watching. That night, the power fluctuated across D-Wing for exactly 13 seconds. Cameras blinked. Lights surged. Electronic bolts paused halfway through their automatic midnight reset. In those 13 seconds, a message, short, simple, unmistakable, was scratched onto the small steel table in Elias's infirmary room. We don't fail. The next morning, Elias Ward refused to speak. Not to officers. Not to medical staff. Not to investigators. He lay still, staring at the ceiling, trembling at every sound. Whatever he had been sent to deliver or retrieve had been intercepted before he could act. And Huxley had made sure he understood that failure wasn't an option. Not for him. Not for anyone. Inside the Organized Crime Squad headquarters, Detective Sergeant Mara Lennox stared at the case files spread across her desk. She wasn't a conspiracy theorist. She wasn't someone who chased shadows. But the disappearance of a correctional officer, the sudden arrival of a misfiled inmate, and the surveillance glitches all pointed to something deeply coordinated. Huxley wasn't just maintaining influence behind bars. He was orchestrating something. Something large. Something long-term. Something he'd prepared for years before stepping foot inside Goulburn. Lennox dug deeper into his past, looking for patterns others had missed. Financial movements disguised as shell companies. Overseas calls routed through forgotten telecom networks. Associates who had vanished in the months leading up to his arrest. connections to figures who operated far outside the boundaries of street crime. Huxley hadn't been a traditional kingpin. He'd been building a structure, a system, a network that did not rely on one person, but instead on strategy, discipline, and silence. The turning point came when Lennox located a sealed testimony from a former syndicate lieutenant, someone who had refused to talk during the trial but had provided a confidential statement under protection. One line stood out. He told us he'd lead for as long as he could on the outside. But the real leadership begins when he goes inside. That's where the empire grows. Lennox felt her heart skip. Huxley hadn't lost control when he entered Goulburn. He descended. Meanwhile, inside the prison, officers noticed subtle shifts. Contraband attempts dropped to zero. Violent altercations ceased without explanation. Rival inmates stopped looking at each other with hatred and instead carried a strange, unified caution, like soldiers who'd been given the same unseen order. And then there was the incident with the ventilation system. 2 guards on routine patrol heard something metallic shift behind the walls. When maintenance opened the panel, they found a hidden scrap of paper, folded, deliberate, undamaged by airflow. It carried a list of inmate numbers with a date beneath them. A date 2 weeks away. Every inmate on that list belonged to a known syndicate operating somewhere in Australia's criminal underworld. Different groups, different loyalties, different agendas. Yet they had all been marked for something. When the warden brought the list to Huxley's cell, Huxley simply smiled for the first time since entering the facility. A slow, calm, chilling smile. The warden demanded answers. But Huxley only whispered 2 words. Phase 2. That night, Detective Lennox received a call from an anonymous source with a fractured, trembling voice. "He's not in prison," the caller whispered. "Not really. He's expanding." Before she could ask anything else, the line went dead. And somewhere deep inside Goulburn Supermax, as the lights dimmed into their routine night mode, every inmate on the mysterious list sat awake in perfect silence, waiting, as if they knew exactly what was coming. The countdown to the date on the hidden list moved like a quiet storm through Goulburn Supermax. No fights, no noise, no tension between rival crews. Just a heavy, unnatural calm that even the most seasoned correctional officers couldn't explain. It felt like the entire prison was holding its breath. Detective Sergeant Mara Lennox didn't wait for permission to act. She pushed for emergency warrants, broadened surveillance, and mapped every inmate number from the mysterious note to their known affiliations. What she found made her stomach knot. Each inmate belonged to a criminal syndicate with long histories and international reach, but none of them had any direct ties to Damon Huxley. Yet something bound them together. She couldn't see the pattern. Not yet. Inside Goulburn, officers doubled their rounds. They checked ventilation systems, rewired cameras, reinforced lockdown protocols. But the inmates on the list remained eerily compliant. They didn't whisper. They didn't pass notes. They didn't request anything. They sat, waiting, like chess pieces placed by a single hand. The night before the marked date, a thick blanket of fog rolled across the prison yard, smothering the electric floodlights in damp white haze. It drifted past the perimeter fences, swallowing the watchtowers, making the entire compound feel like a floating island cut off from the world. At 2:13 a.m., every camera in D-Wing flickered. Not off, not on, just a soft static pulse. One quick shudder across the screens in the control room. The officers stiffened. Another pulse hit 30 seconds later. Then another. Inside his cell, Damon Huxley stood calmly in the center of the room. His hands were folded behind his back. His expression was the same composed, unreadable mask he'd worn every day since entering Goulburn. But his eyes, cold, focused, unmoving, were fixed on the corner camera, as if he were waiting for someone. At 2:17 a.m., the static pulses stopped. The screen stabilized. Everything returned to normal, or so the officers believed. Detective Lennox didn't sleep that night. She combed through surveillance timestamps, cross-referencing them with archived records of Huxley's previous communications. That's when she noticed it. The timing of the pulses. 3 surges, evenly spaced, always 30 seconds apart. It wasn't a glitch. It was a signal. She grabbed her keys and headed out the door before she could even call for backup. By the time she reached Goulburn, the sun was beginning to cut through the night fog. Officers were already on high alert, scanning every block for signs of trouble. But the inmates on the list, every single one of them, sat on the edges of their beds, calm, staring forward, waiting. The warden ordered full lockdown. Just as the final metal bolt sealed into place, every inmate on the list stood up, in perfect unison. Their movements were slow, deliberate, mechanical. Dozens of men from rival networks, syndicates, and corners of the underworld, all rising at the exact same second. A murmur rippled through the prison. Then the inmates stepped toward the center of their cells and placed their hands behind their backs. Correctional officers, rattled by the synchronized behavior, rushed the cells, demanding explanations. But the inmates said nothing, not a word. They only repeated a single action, standing still, hands behind their backs, heads down, every one of them. The warden stormed toward Huxley's cell. "What did you do?" he demanded. "You orchestrating a riot? A mass attack? What is this?" Huxley looked up slowly. "It's not a riot," he said. "It's order." Detective Lennox arrived just as officers began documenting the bizarre behavior. She walked straight to Huxley's door, her voice sharp, controlled, and edged with fear. "What is Phase 2?" she asked. Huxley smiled faintly. "Phase 2 already happened." He lifted his wrist and tapped the inside of it twice. A subtle gesture, a chilling one. Lennox stared at him, confused. Then realization hit her with the force of a punch. It wasn't about what the inmates were going to do. It was about what had already been set in motion outside the walls. She sprinted out of D Wing, dialing her team. Trace every known associate, every financial shell, every communications channel. Checkports, airports, encrypted networks. Huxley's using the prison as the illusion. The operation isn't happening here. It's happening out there. But as her team scrambled into action, one of the officers called out, "Detective, there's something else." The inmates on the list had begun to sit down. Again at the same second. 47 men. 47 synchronized movements. She swallowed hard. "This is a countdown." "Countdown to what?" the warden asked. Before she could answer, her phone buzzed. A secure channel alert. She put it to her ear. A shaken intelligence officer spoke in a hollow voice. "Mara, it's already started. 3 major hits across Sydney. Businesses with suspected ties to Huxley's competitors. All struck within the last hour. Precise. Coordinated. 0 civilian casualties. Like the offenders knew exactly where to be." She froze. Huxley hadn't built a prison empire. He'd built a remote control network. A network that used silence as communication. Time intervals as orders. Inmates as signals. He didn't need to issue instructions verbally. He could communicate through behavior, through ritual, through synchronized movement, through fear. Mara turned back toward Huxley's cell. His hands were behind his back again, just like the others. Only he wasn't signaling them. He was signaling someone beyond the walls. And she suddenly understood the real horror. Goulburn Supermax wasn't containing him. It was amplifying him. Huxley looked up, his voice soft, almost polite. "You stopped looking for what I was doing," he said. "You should have asked why. Why are you doing this?" Lennox asked. His eyes locked onto hers, unblinking. "To prove that a cage doesn't limit power," he said. "It concentrates it." Before she could speak, another alert hit her phone. Another coordinated hit. Then another. And another. Each one executed with precision. Each one carried out by individuals with no prior ties to Huxley. The network had grown far beyond the prison. Lennox stepped back, breath trembling. Huxley's voice chased her down the hall. "Detective," he murmured, "I suggest you subscribe to the next chapter. Things are only beginning." As she reached the exit, the alarms across Goulburn Supermax began to scream. The countdown had reached 0.